this is a good segue into a broader conversation we were having the other day with some friends. We just watched the horror film Hereditary for our movie club. We're in with a bunch of friends of ours, watch a movie every couple weeks and get together and talk about it. And um, Hereditary is one of my all-time favorite movies. I think it's fantastic. But there was this
Mhm.
very interesting conversation we got into that Kyle and I thought we would continue here about maybe the state of horror and the history of horror. Because we I think we have turned into a bit of horror fans. We used to not be. Used to be terrified little babies, as Kyle might still be, but
Yeah.
I think we've turned our around a little bit. And for me, it was It. Is that the same for you? The new It is what changed it for me.
Mm, it was probably around that time, but I thought there was some others. I can't remember the whole release slate at that time, but that could have been one of them.
I know It for me was when I was like, okay, I'm in on these type of horror films. I'm in. I'm
Mhm.
in on horror. I'm not just in on a Shutter Island style horror. I'm in on this type of jump scare, demon monster horror. The Conjuring followed right after. I absolutely love it. It Follows, I think, has been amazing. That was at that around that time of getting into horror,
Yeah.
and then we backpedaled. And at the end of our college days, we were starting to watch a bunch, and Paranormal Activity now I've seen. I watched The Nightmare on Elm Street for the first time just a couple of weeks ago on a plane. Loved it, held up.
Nice.
I know. And so yeah, so we got in this conversation because a lot of the people that have watched this Hereditary had not seen really any horror movie.
Mhm.
So there was an interesting conversation to be had of because some of our friends were like, "This movie is not very scary to me. It wasn't what I was expecting because I went in thinking this was one of, if not the scariest movie ever made," and they were like, so it didn't really get me in that way. And I feel like they went more towards a psychological thriller kind of feel with it. But I'll let you take the reins here, and we can continue this broader conversation. But yeah, take it over from me here.
Oh, well, part of the conversation that was first interesting to me was um them being a little unsuspected of the type of horror that this movie was. And I think it expands out to more general audiences than I ever realized. In that horror genre isn't one type of thing. I think it's common for most audiences now to view horror as jump scare, jump scare in your face, monster slasher type of flair. I don't think that those of the general audiences really realize that there's more, not layers, but more types of sub genre horror that, isn't just suddenly only happening because of A24 films, for example, but has been going on since horror movies first came out. I mean, if you look through, horror and the different um throughout the history, the past couple of or the past few years, you'll see like different time periods have had different types of horror. There's time periods where they had the slasher horror movies. There's time periods where they had the zombie horror movies. But
Oh, the
y-
zombie
uh,
craze in the mid to
y-
late 2000s and 2010s was insane.
sure, like
It
that's a
was
perfectly good
insane.
example. I mean, the '70s, had the paranormal possession type of horror movies. But at the same time, though, throughout them all, there's always movies that pop up that are more than what they appear to be at face value. Like they have, character driven narratives to them. They have deeper themes to themselves. And I think that's where audiences don't realize that about horror. Like it is, and that's not to say you can't enjoy, the blockbuster jump scare horror movies. That not at all. But I think horror is just one of the more interesting genres to where it can almost be anything as long as it scares you in some type of way. And I think now that we've become better fans of horror, Alex, you and I, is because we've had that excuse me, that realization that it's not just the jump scare type. Like there could be many different ideologies when it comes to the genre.
Yeah, one of the things a friend of ours said during that conversation that I really loved is he said that horror and comedy are probably the most subjective of any genre of film
Mhm,
because it's what scares you and what makes you laugh. I think it's
mhm,
so easy. It goes back all the way, I think, to the conversation of why comedians are always so good in dramatic roles. And people, I think, have it backwards where they think it's harder to make people cry than it is to laugh. And it's the opposite. It's much harder to make people laugh than it is to make them cry.
mhm.
And um with horror, I think that is so true. There's so many subgenres of horror that and A24 I think has been the best at doing that for a long time. Why can't I think of the production company that has been rocking it with horror lately with our boy? Why can't I think of it? What's the name of it?
I think you're talking about Blumhouse, aren't you?
I am talking about Bloomhouse. I want to look up Bloomhouse's like production order here for a second because I think that really will help us look at some of the things they've been because I think Bloomhouse is huge for the horror kind of renaissance. Um,
It's part of it, that's for sure. And I think it's because of Blumhouse and A24 that audiences are starting to take notice that there's other types of horror movies, but they're not understanding of how that's possible, if that makes sense. At least that's just me coming from where I'm at and how I view movies. And I think if people really took a second, do a deep dive into horror and go back years and years into the past, like they'll realize that there's different, types of horrors. That's what I mentioned before. But at the end of the day, like if they're like, especially the really good ones, you could see that there's character driven type stories, or there's types of horror movies where it psychologically is affecting you or it's getting under your skin. You're not necessarily, like jumping out of your seat with the popcorn splashing everywhere. And I think people just don't realize that. And, when you come across a horror movie that isn't what you expect, then you're not sure if that's how you should be labeled as scared, or maybe you just haven't realized before that you can be scared in other ways when it comes to movies.
yeah, Bloomhouse. From what I'm looking at here, started. I didn't realize they started with Paranormal Activity. That was kind of their first big production hit. So
Mhm.
Paranormal Activity, I think, is the poster for jump scare. Here we go. I think that's where jump scares really took an effect because I think the horror movies before that were pretty popular. I think like one of the biggest was the Blair Witch, which I just watched for the first time ever a couple weeks ago as well. And the Blair Witch is not jump scare. It's much more, I think, in the vein of a Hereditary when you're kind of labeling the style of horror of more psychological than and Hereditary is definitely I think scarier, but so they come out with Paranormal Activity, then they go to like Insidious Chapter 2, The Purge. Some people think Insidious is one of the scariest movies they've ever seen.
Mhm.
Um, they came out with Whiplash, which again has very horror elements to it, an incredible Oscar-winning movie, but
Elements,
but
yeah.
but it definitely has elements of horror that Blumhouse has been very good at doing.
Mhm.
They
Mhm.
come out with The Gift, great underground horror movie. The
That one's
Visit,
pretty good.
which kind
Yeah.
of brought back M. Night Shyamalan a little bit. With Split and Get Out,
Was
that
that
was
Shyamalan's?
huge. Oh
The
yeah.
Gift was? Oh,
Yeah.
what am I thinking of?
No, not The Gift. The Visit was M.
Oh,
Night. The
sorry.
Gift is
Sorry, I
Joel
misheard you
Edgerton.
then. Yes, yeah.
Both of those though came out at the same year.
Mhm,
Um,
mhm.
and so they had movies like Unfriended, which was a weird Skype movie or something like that it made a ton of money for them.
Yeah.
Happy Death Day was huge for
Horror
Blumhouse
comedy.
with this type of
Yeah.
horror, a horror comedy, and they're making tons of different versions of these horror movies. But I do think with Paranormal Activity, Insidious, I think The Conjuring, it started this bigger trend of jump scare horror, of
Mhm.
us getting shocked of what's around the corner.
Yeah.
Conjuring a bit less so, but I think that started a trend, and I think for people of our generation, that's what we are a little more used to is that style of
Mhm.
horror. And then a
Sure.
movie like a Hereditary comes around the corner, and it's not that type. I think even something at like Pearl and X more recently that are more horror, they're horror movies, they're a different style with A24, but they also are more, I think, in the vein of what Hereditary does than more jump scare. It's a little bit more gore. You even think of what James Wan does in the early 2000s. He comes out with Conjuring. He comes out with torture porn with the Saw franchise, which, there is so much to horror here, and it's a very interesting conversation. What are the thoughts you got?
Well, one other thing I want to point out is that I think because of people noticing, the types of horror movies like the A24s and the more
Blumhouse.
not in your face horror movies,
Oh,
it's
sure.
caused a labeling that I see throughout social media called elevated horror, which
I've never heard of this.
I feel like it's kind of a turn off of a term. Because it feels like by labeling that term, you're making it sound very uppity and prestige when um I don't know. Those types of terminologies just rub me the wrong way, especially nowadays, just because I think people who don't like those movies or tend to, think lesser of those more character driven movies just use that labeling so that way they can make it an excuse to not watch it. But I think especially when it comes to horror, like it's just not the right term. Like horror movies for years and years and years have been very much character driven or very much have had themes or different types of way to scare you. So labeling it um as
Elevated horror.
that just kind of rubs me the wrong way because it's not to me necessarily true at all. It's horror, but there's just different types of it. But you don't need
Yeah.
to label it as that. So that's
So
kind of
I
my
I
only
had
other
never heard
thought I
that
wanted
term
to.
before. So I just Googled it, elevated horror. And I get what you mean,
Mhm.
right? I guess it would be more artsy fartsy horror. You know what I mean? Like that's what it feels
Yeah.
like. And the list of movies that come up immediately: Hereditary, Midsummer, Mother.
Mhm.
Mother, it's not a horror movie. Mother's a trash movie and it's boring as all get out. The Lighthouse, Babadook, The Witch, It Follows, even Raw, which came out a while ago,
Mm.
2016, which is a very good horror movie. And I was scrolling through, and the first thing I see is John Carpenter has no idea what elevated horror means, is one of the first headlines of an article. And John Carpenter's the master of horror. And I
John
think what
Carpenter knows what he's talking about.
yeah, no, what I think my guess is, and I had not reading that article because it says
Mhm.
John Carpenter has no idea what elevated horror means, is John Carpenter saying, why are we putting these weird labels? It's still horror, is my
Yeah.
guess, is exactly what we're talking about. Because if you look at The Thing, John Carpenter's The Thing is one of the scariest movies to this date. I would put
Mhm.
it up against some of those movies that we're talking about. I just watched it in theaters a couple months ago because they were showing it for an anniversary. It is terrifying. And this
Mhm.
elevated horror aspect is very true. I brought this point up in our conversation that I think is really interesting because I think this elevated horror, this artsy fartsy, is just another term for psychological horror because all these movies, um, and It Follows is actually, I think, not in this term. Just looking at what they have here listed. Um, but a lot of these movies are not okay, there's a demon, a villain, a antagonist. We have to overcome the antagonist in some way.
Mhm.
Midsummer doesn't really have that. Neither does Hereditary. Mother sucks. The Babadook does actually have that in a way, and yet also doesn't. The Witch also has that in a way, and yet doesn't. So I
Mhm.
think It Follows is fighting a monster. It's just a monster in a new and unique, different way of telling that story. Raw, same way. And so I think this elevated horror term is just people who think they're better than everybody in the film community, who make student films to this day still that are just not great, who want to put a label on it because they want to act as if it's superior. Hereditary is one of the greatest movies I've ever seen. I don't know if it's superior than The Exorcist. And The Exorcist is still one of the scariest movies I've ever seen. The
Easily.
Conjuring is one of the scary. I think It Chapter 1 is one of the scariest movies I've ever seen. And they're all four of those movies are drastically different in how they handle their horror. And so I think that putting these labels on it doesn't matter. Does it scare you in some way? Bingo, you're in. That's what
Mhm.
matters. Like one of the things when I watched Hereditary with a buddy of ours that we talked about when we were done is like, okay, it didn't really have jump scare horror. Like there are a couple scenes that have that there. I think in the very beginning of Hereditary, I guess I thought it was the beginning. Apparently, I was corrected. It's a good 45 minutes into the film, but um, but like that movie makes me uncomfortable the whole time. There are a
Yep.
few moments I'm like, oh, gore and things like that, but I am uncomfortable from start to finish. My heart is
Mhm.
racing from start to finish. The score, everything that involved in that movie does that. Midsummer does that too. I'm uncomfortable. It Follows does that. Guess what else does that? The Exorcist, It, The Conjuring, Insidious for most of it, I think. I think Insidious dates itself a little bit because the demon's been memed so much as Darth Maul, um,
Sure.
but I Paranormal Activity, I watched for the first time a few years ago, and that movie is pretty scary. And I think people forget how scary it is. And they're all different types of horror. And it's a very interesting conversation. And I'm so glad I'm into horror. It's making me want to. They have a horror streaming service that's like just horror movies. I've been thinking about paying that for a month and just binging as many as I can because I
Mhm.
want to get caught up on some of these great horror movies. But then again, it's tough. Halloween goes by, and you're suddenly like, all right, it's time for Charlie Brown Christmas special. It's time for Elf. It's time. I
Mhm.
hear the jingles. I hear the bells. I gotta wait till next year. But anyway, any more thoughts on this horror, or should we move on?
I just encourage people to expand the boundaries on horror because I think you'll be surprised, like whether it's in different decades that you're watching, or maybe it's current day movies, but they're not the types of movies you would normally
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
expect yourself to watch. Just give it a chance because you might really be surprised by the different types of ways that you'll be getting scared. And then spread the word about those movies because a lot of them are very under the radar, or there are a lot of
Yep.
classics that people should be checking out. So um, glad we got that out of our system. The horror genre has
Yeah.
become a very interesting one for Alex and
One of
myself,
my
and we hope
favorites.
this convo was too.